I hope you all had a great lunch, or are having a great lunch, and enjoying some time connecting with friends. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panel discussion, Advocacy in Action, addressing the antibiotic-resistant infections. This discussion is one we're all pretty excited about, and you'll have the opportunity to ask our panelists questions. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelist speakers. Today, we are joined by Ella Balasa, an adult with cystic fibrosis and a volunteer with the Virginia chapter. She will serve as our moderator today. Kevin Outterson, Esquire, Executive Director and Principal Investigator, CARB-X, Professor of Law, Boston University. Mary Dwight, Senior Vice President and Chief Policy and Advocacy Officer with the CF Foundation, and Tiffany Burnett, Senior Director of Biopharma Programs at the CF Foundation. Thank you for being part of this important discussion. Today's panel will explore the rising threat of antibiotic-resistant infections, how this threat impacts the cystic fibrosis community, the importance of how we show up for each other and enact change, and finally, how each one of you can use your voice and individual experiences with infections to urge comprehensive solutions. Solutions that address the marketplace issues that keep novel antibiotics from getting into the hands of people with CF. Ella Balasa has committed her time to empowering patients and advancing healthcare strategies. She speaks publicly about the value of the patient perspective and has a passion for distilling critical information for patient communities. She aims to affect the healthcare landscape by raising awareness of rare diseases, promoting self-advocacy to patients, and providing valuable insights to healthcare organizations. Please join me in welcoming Ella.
Thank you, Julie, and the warmest welcome to everyone joining us in person and online this year. I am honored to be among you and to share in the discussion that is really close to my heart. So I'll begin by sharing with you my experience battling antibiotic resistance throughout my life, and really put a face to the devastating effects of these infections for those of us with CF. Obviously, because of CF, I face a heightened lifelong risk of infection. So the mucus that is trapped in the lungs, the bacteria leads to infections, and then over time causing extensive lung damage. And to date, the only effective therapeutics that we have for infections are for those of us with CF are antibiotics. And they've really been my lifeline. Throughout my life, from infancy through adulthood, I have spent weeks in the hospital each year getting treated for infections that over time have become more and more difficult to treat, where they've gained resistance, and because of using the same few antibiotics cycled many times all of these years. And with each infection, there are fewer effective antibiotic options, and it really is terrifying. Oral and inhaled antibiotics are hit or miss and no longer very effective. And then the last 2 or 3 years, I've been on them pretty consistently to subdue the infections. And even in my most recent past, the intravenous antibiotics have lost their potency. So 2 years ago, I battled one of the most difficult infections that I'd ever faced. And even some of the strongest antibiotics that we have in our arsenal today, which is colistin, had no effect against the battle in my body. It was a shell of an existence. Julie talked about Chad living with very low lung function, and at that time, I had 18% lung function. And had intravenous antibiotics being pumped through my veins 24/7, coughing endlessly, unable to breathe. The Pseudomonas bacteria in my lungs was destroying them, and I had no modern medicine available to step in. I felt helpless, defeated, and frankly on death's door. By a chance of fate and some luck and risk, I tried an experimental treatment called phage therapy that did halt that devastating infection. And without it, I don't think that I'd be here today sharing the story. But since that experience, my plight really has ignited my passion for talking about antibiotic resistance, sharing my story, bringing awareness and change to hopefully elicit spur medical treatment and advancement so that others don't have to face the same battle in the future. And for those that may not be as fortunate in their outcomes as I was. But in addition, my battle isn't over either. Despite being on Trikafta now to treat the underlying cause of CF, I'm still plagued by the bacteria in my lungs, the chronic infections. I'm still using antibiotics frequently, and they still don't have great efficacy. And even when the cycle of infections and inflammations completely do destroy my lung tissue, and then I require a double lung transplant to sustain my life, I will still be susceptible to infections because of a suppressed immune system. So, many others too face antibiotic-resistant infections, even those that have not chronically used antibiotics, like those of us with CF, but because of an increasing prevalence of these bacteria in our environment and in our surroundings and around us, it makes us much more likely for us to encounter them. This is something we'll talk about too on this panel. Antibiotic resistance is a significant crisis for our global population. So my plea is to urge drug manufacturers and researchers and investors and policymakers to strategize ways that we can get new antibiotics, new antimicrobials to our market quickly for treatment availability. And it's really important that we think about novel approaches because these infections are really adaptive and resilient to antibiotics, and we have to be one step ahead of them. So, exploring alternate ways of attacking them is really important, like bacteriophage therapy. And I very much hope for a day when resistant infections aren't the greatest threat to my life and to many others. Excuse me. And I will continue to bring awareness and to advocate for this dire issue until bacteria are no longer perpetually one step ahead of us and a threat to my life. So that ends my experience and my thoughts on this, but I'm excited to get into this panel and discuss further. But before we do so, I want to share a short message from Todd Young, who is a senator from Indiana, who is co-sponsoring what is called the PASTEUR Act. And that's also something we'll talk about later on.
Hello, I'm Senator Todd Young. More than 2.8 million antibiotic-resistant infections occur in the United States each year, resulting in the deaths of 35,000 Americans. Unless our pharmaceutical innovators create new drugs, antimicrobial resistance has the potential to kill 10 million people annually by 2050. For those with conditions like cystic fibrosis, antibiotics are a matter of life and death when it comes to fighting off infections. That's why I've partnered with Senator Burnett to introduce the PASTEUR Act. Our bill invests in the research and development of life-saving antibiotics and focuses on educating healthcare providers on how to avoid the overuse or misuse of these critical medicines. I'd like to thank the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation for its unwavering support of the PASTEUR Act. I look forward to getting this legislation across the finish line to help ensure that antimicrobial resistance is an issue of the past. I
would now like to welcome our panelists. That's Kevin, Mary, and Tiffany. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to now start the panel discussion. So Mary, I'll start with you. The foundation has been focusing on antibiotic-resistant infections for a while now. So can you talk more about the connection between CF and antimicrobial resistance, building on kind of the introduction that I gave?
Sure. Thanks, Ella. It's great to be here today with all of you, and we're really excited to be able to have this conversation. When we're here about cystic fibrosis this weekend, right? But when you think about this topic of antibiotics, it's really so much broader. When you really think about it, antibiotics really are a bedrock, if not the bedrock, of modern medicine. There's almost nothing that touches medicine today where antibiotics aren't critically important. From everything from school sports to safe surgeries, and certainly cystic fibrosis. Ella, your story really illustrated such an example of how cystic fibrosis in many ways is a microcosm of the critical need for antibiotics, for them to be effective, but also of the risk of resistance and the risk of what we may face if we lose efficacy in antibiotics. So I think everyone here likely knows that people with cystic fibrosis have a unique relationship, a frequent, unfortunately, relationship with chronic respiratory infections. It's such a hallmark of life with cystic fibrosis. And because of that chronic infection and that chronic vulnerability, there's a routine use of antibiotics in cystic fibrosis, far more than you would see in sort of the general population. And with that routine use comes a real risk of resistance. So I wanted to just sort of share a few things that, again, Ella's story did such a beautiful and disturbing job of illustrating what we're really facing in cystic fibrosis, but to give you sort of a bigger picture writ large. So we've had remarkable progress in cystic fibrosis, and the modulators really have changed the course of the disease. But even with these therapies, and I think I'm probably not telling folks something they don't already know, infections remain a serious problem in cystic fibrosis. The infections can lead to decreased lung function, increased or elongated hospitalizations, worsening lung disease, leading to transplant potentially, and even death. We know that the cystic fibrosis population experiences a lot of bugs that are out there at a disproportionate rate. For example, 25% of people with cystic fibrosis will culture MRSA each year. The median age of that infection is 11. And it, again, is one of those bugs that can worsen lung disease and lead to increased hospitalizations and decreased survival. People with CF, as Ella talked about, are prone to Pseudomonas, another scary infection. 40% of people with CF cultured for the infection of Pseudomonas in 2019 alone. And as Ella shared, once Pseudomonas is in the airways, it's very hard to eradicate. So in many ways, for the topic we're talking about today, cystic fibrosis is really a microcosm of the need for antibiotics, the need for multiple antibiotics that can treat multiple different infections, but also, unfortunately, the potential risks and the real risk we're facing right now of antibiotic resistance. We may refer to that sometimes in today's panel as AMR, but when we use that acronym, what we mean is antibiotic resistance. And we'll try to behave ourselves and not use too many acronyms, but we are in Washington and we love our acronyms here. So. It's really, we're a rare disease, but in many ways we're the tip of the spear on this major global problem of antibiotic resistance, where we face the risk of not having drugs in hand that can treat these infections that we know are out there in CF. So I think for those reasons, and again, I think I'm probably not telling folks something they don't already know, it is critical that we have a robust arsenal of antibiotics to be able to fight these infections that are chronic in CF. And we're losing ground. We're losing ground because too many of the tools already in our toolbox are becoming increasingly ineffective against the bugs that we see.
Thank you. And that segues nicely into my next question, where, Kevin, I'll turn it to you. And can you talk more about broadly how like what the threat of antibiotic resistance is and how that poses to all of us, the global population, not just those with cystic fibrosis.
Well, hello to everybody. I'm very honored to be speaking at this event today. I'm a law professor, but I've worked for the past 20 years on issues that around difficulties with antimicrobial resistance. Since 2016, I've led the largest funder of this in this space since 2016. And I have to say that the problem keeps getting worse. In 2014, under President Obama, the CDC put out a report that detailed how many million Americans were getting drug-resistant infections from bacteria. And in 2019, under President Trump, the CDC updated those numbers, and it was even worse. Recently, a global effort to count was made by the people who do the Global Burden of Disease study in Seattle, and they published their results in The Lancet. And it showed globally 1.27 million people dying as a result of drug-resistant bacterial infections every single year. And then we have the CDC report from a couple days ago, which showed that under the COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of use of antibiotics, or especially earlier in the pandemic when we weren't sure, that were unnecessary. And a lot of hospitals, some of their attention to bacterial infections in the hospital were distracted because everyone was so tired and all the effort was focused on COVID. And many hospitals were completely understaffed and healthcare workers were stretched beyond imagination. And so we've actually had an increase in the number of deaths in the United States from drug-resistant infection in the 2.5 years we've been in the pandemic. This is a serious issue. It kills more people than HIV globally, more people than malaria. And we're not giving it the same sort of attention that's due, given those number of deaths. Everything in modern medicine, like was said a moment ago, rests on this as a safety net. For people with cancer, the second leading cause of death, infection. Imagine every sort of surgery that people have your grandmother needs a hip or knee replacement or something. That requires antibiotics to make sure that they don't come out of that surgery with a serious infection which could threaten their life. So while I'm grateful to be here, and certainly the CF community is at the forefront of people that have to deal with this on an ongoing basis, like Ella, it is really an issue that threatens the health of not just every American, but people all over the world. Most of those 1.27 million deaths are actually in the poorer countries of the world. And it's just a burden that we do not have to bear. This is something that we can do something about, and we'll talk about that later.
Thanks, Kevin. And that's what I want to start getting into now is what can we do? What's being done for getting new research and investment into developing new treatment options. So I'll turn to Tiffany now and let her discuss the Foundation's efforts in battling resistant infections in people with CF. So in 2018, the Foundation established the Infection Research Initiative, and this was to help address some of the issues from the research and development space. So Tiffany, can you tell us more about this initiative and some highlights of the work? For also a little background, I was part of the on the patient perspective on this committee for about 2 years. So it was a really wonderful experience, and I'll share about that too. But Tiffany, I'll let you go ahead.
Thanks, Ella, and it's good to see you again. I'm going to start off with sharing a little bit about the Infection Research Initiative and all the progress we've made thus far. When the initiative was started, it was with a $100 million investment over 5 years to attract new research, prioritize and align the current and academic portfolio that we have, and to enhance transparency and communications. As part of this initiative, we work very closely with the steering committee, which Ella is a part of, and actually Mary Lee Phillips is a co-chair of this committee. And we actually also work with subject matter experts and CF staff, and this initiative is grounded on 6 research priorities. I'll just highlight a few of those priorities, but the top three really are developing new treatments, understanding microorganisms, and improving detection and diagnosis. And as part of the initiative, I'm also happy to share a few highlights. In first quarter of this year, we actually achieved that financial milestone of awarding $100 million, and I'm really excited about that. With that, we have over 200 research grants in the academic space, and we also have over 20 industry programs that are active. So there's a lot of excitement going on in the Infection Research Initiative, and part of why the initiative is even here is a call to action from the community. So it's really a pleasure to work with the community as part of advancing this science, because we get the intel on what's really important to the community as we move forward with this. And each year we meet and we get a chance to talk about those priorities and reprioritize if we need to, but also just share the great work that we're doing and working across other companies like CARB-X as well.
And to add to that, last year, as part of the steering committee, we surveyed the CF community and researchers and physicians as well, and found that across the board, the development of new therapeutics and new treatment options are the #1 focus for the community, obviously. So that was something I think we all knew, but it just really emphasizes that the importance in that. So Tiffany, again, while this initiative, it focuses on research that is impacting those of us with CF, how might this research apply more broadly as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ella. And in terms of how this research applies more broadly, several of the programs that we are developing actually are in Pseudomonas and MRSA. And those compounds actually fall on the CDC and WHO urgent list of critical pathogens. So that work, in fact, is actually going to help everyone globally, whether it's progress with the therapeutic. It will be available to everyone. It wouldn't just be available to people with CF, but also the learnings that we have will be in publications. We'll share those learnings in conferences. So again, we're actually really doing our part to advance this work. And again, we work with folks like CARB-X, and we work with folks in other parts of the world sharing this information. In addition to that, Ella, just a couple of other things. We also have several compounds that are multi-pathogen approach. So, again, they have the opportunity to kill more bugs than just one. And also when we look at our novel compounds that are in our portfolio, those are kind of our superstars, like they have the opportunity to do a lot. So, again, in essence, probably over 50% of our research is actually supporting AMR work in some way, including some of the new things that we're doing in detection.
So as you mentioned, this initiative, the $100 million investment has been surpassed. And so what is next in terms of the initiative and for funding? What do you all see in the near future?
So in the future, we will continue to follow the science. We will continue to fund all science that makes sense in terms of fighting AMR and fighting infection for people with CF. We will continue to fund our academic research, focusing on optimizing current treatments and understanding the future of infection in the era of modulators. We also will continue to really pound the pavement with drug delivery companies and drug discovery companies to make sure that we are investing in the best science around therapeutic development. And one other exciting thing that's happening is that we are looking to do a trial in fungus, a prospective trial in Aspergillus. So that's an area that also plagues people with CF. And we are really looking forward to that trial moving forward. We will be having a session tomorrow focused just on infection. And I welcome you to join that session to hear a bit more about our portfolio and to just hear all the other happenings in our basic research and our clinical research.
Well, it really is exciting that there is, investment in research really happening within CF, from the CFF and from other organizations and groups as well. But Kevin, I'll turn to you now. And there is a unique economic challenge associated with the development of new antibiotics. So can you share more about that with us?
It's complex, but the core is that these drugs degrade with use as you use them because of resistance. And that's not true of aspirin, thank goodness, or of all sorts of other drugs that we have in the world, but it is true for anything that kills, a microbe, a virus, bacteria. And so if you talk to the doctors who use these in hospitals, they want to be careful with the new drugs, and this is the correct thing to do. We call this antibiotic stewardship. We don't want to waste the brand new drug that we find to bring to market. We want to be careful with it. That is wonderful for health, but it's a disaster for the companies because they work for 10 to 12 to 15 years to bring something to market. And then we've seen remarkably small sales of new antibiotics when they hit the market, mainly because they're put on the shelf. All of them are classified as reserve antibiotics by the World Health Organization. And we don't use them very much at first. And that might be fine in health, that in 5 or 10 years we still have these antibiotics around, they've not been wasted, but the company will have gone away. And so I've studied the last 18 antibiotics that were approved by a major country, and more than half of the compounds, and more than half of those approved drugs, the companies associated with them have either gone bankrupt or been sold at a fire sale price that resulted in a washout for all the investors. So that's shocking that approved drugs, drugs that made it through all the hard things, the 1 out of 1,000 that finally make it to FDA approval, they should normally be celebrating, but instead half of them are being ground into bankruptcy or something darn close to that. So we've been thinking, a group of stakeholders and academics for more than a decade, we need to think of a new way to pay for antibiotics, paying for their value to society, not really paying for the volume sold, especially in the early years. And this idea was taken up by the United Kingdom, by England, and they have actually endorsed this and have picked 2 antibiotics and have decided to build a subscription model in which the country will pay for these 2 antibiotics the same, significant amount, so that the company is happy with the revenues from England. But that amount does not vary whether there's 1 dose or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000. It's a subscription that gives England unlimited access to these drugs for the next decade. In the United States, the version of this idea is the PASTEUR Act, something that we actually have broad consensus across many stakeholders that paying for antibiotics in a different way will actually result in better innovation. So I'll give a quick example on Pseudomonas. It's hard for companies with a drug that focuses only on Pseudomonas to find any investors right now. Outside of Carbex, and we're a nonprofit, and the CF Foundation, almost no one else. Because the private investors can't see a possibility of a return on investment. Because there's not enough patients, it's hard to find them outside of CF. It's hard to find them in time to enroll them in trials, and it's hard to find them when it's time to use it after approval. So a subscription proposal would dramatically alter the way that these drugs come to market. And in my published work, it says that it would actually result in tremendous innovation, finally reaching patients without the companies themselves being forced into bankruptcy.
So this is the PASTUER Act, and the CFF has been involved in advocating for this and hopefully getting it through Congress. So Mary, I'll turn to you. Maybe you can share a bit more about it, and then also how, in general, how the CFF is advocating for solutions and policies for antibiotic resistance.
Sure. Well, Kevin did a beautiful job of describing the act itself, and really it's fixing a pretty significant problem that we have here in antibiotics. So I think, as you heard from Tiffany, and also Kevin didn't speak about Carbex's investment in antibiotics, but these 2 entities, we're putting our money where our mouth is in terms of the science to drive the science, to drive new therapies. But as Kevin described, none of that is going to work if at the end of that great science, when we have a new antibiotic, there's no market. So here comes PASTEUR. And it's a really interesting and innovative idea. As Kevin said, there's proof of concept to this in the UK. And there's a large group of interesting and important stakeholders that have been working for some time, for many years, to introduce this concept here in the US. And the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is one of them. We are actually the only patient group really at the table in the steering committee of this effort. And that's because really, as we said earlier, the cystic fibrosis community is somewhat unique. We all use antibiotics, but really only the CF community uses them all the time and thinks about them pretty regularly. So we've been able to bring that voice to this coalition effort. Some other of our partners include the Infectious Disease Society of America. Those are the infectious disease docs, bio and pharma, which are the industry trade groups, and several other partners that have really been a unique and diverse coalition, all coming together to say, we have to have this. And so the foundation is doing what we do. We bring your voice to push for this. We have to get this done, and what we're really trying to do is to describe the sense of urgency that we have to be able to have this mechanism at the other end of all that great science that Tiffany is leading and that Kevin's working on at CARB-X, to be able to say we have to be able to put something out there to make sure that companies want to come and develop new antibiotics. So granularly, what have we done? Again, we're working in this broad coalition here in Washington to push for this bill. What does that mean? It means we are telling Congress, including champions like Senator Young and Senator Burnett, who you heard from earlier today, to say we've got your back, we want to help you get this done, and to go ask their colleagues in the US Senate and in the United States House to prioritize this and to pass the PASTEUR Act. So we've been mobilizing the mighty CF advocacy community for some time now. Hopefully many of you, raise your hand if you've talked to your member of Congress or sent an email about the PASTEUR Act. Yes, you got to do some more of that, P.S. Stay tuned. We've been advocating this since the bill was introduced a little more than a year ago. We've had over 3,000 community members send almost 10,000 email messages to Capitol Hill. We're hard to ignore when we do that. Our flagship advocacy events this year, March on the Hill in the spring, which was virtual this year, and Teen Advocacy Day just last month. This has been our ask. This has been what we're pushing for. Last month we had 60 teens, including 25 teens with cystic fibrosis, virtually, online asking Congress to pass the PASTEUR Act. And we've also launched a campaign, an ad campaign called Up the Ante, to really pressure Congress and say now is the time to act. And really what this advocacy looks like, in addition to making the ask itself of pass the PASTEUR Act, is sharing stories. Ella, you shared yours beautifully, and I know you've gotten a chance to share your story with members of Congress and several of the forum that we've held to be able to raise attention to this issue. And many others like Ella have joined in us being able to paint the picture of this dire need that we really need to get this done this year. Those stories matter, those personal experiences to paint a picture of what it means to have chronic infection, how important antibiotics are, and also, unfortunately, the risk that we're seeing real time in antibiotic resistance. All of those things we're delivering to Congress, we're sharing with them to, again, I can't say the word enough, create that sense of urgency for them to act as soon as possible, ideally this year, to pass this. So our advocacy efforts are powerful. We like to claim credit in the CF advocacy world, and we've generated over 20 co-sponsors just since the start of summer. Co-sponsors means a member of Congress puts their name on a bill and says, I support this, I want to see it passed. I credit this amazing community, your powerful voices, your amazing stories, to drive members into action and to say, I want to be on board with this, I want to be a part of this. But we're not done, and we have to keep going, and I think in a little bit we'll be able to talk even more specifics about what we need to do to get it across the finish line.
Thanks, Mary. And along those lines, and can you also share a few tangible ways that our audience can get involved and share their stories and advocate for developing new antibiotics?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. Well, it was great in the room to see a ton of hands raised, and I hope a lot of hands were raised online. But pressure matters. So to talk a little shop, since we're in Washington, as you might know from reading the news, they've got a few things going on, and the agenda is a little long. So our job is to be a bit obnoxious and to prioritize this issue as, again, urgent, and to raise the priority of this and to raise the awareness of the issue of antibiotic resistance and the solution that the PASTEUR Act presents by bugging them a lot. How do we do that? Those emails matter. And you know what else matters? Phone calls. And you know what else matters? Meetings, visits, questions into town halls. Anytime you say, this matters to me, then your member of Congress needs to pay attention. So here's how you act. First of all, if you've already acted, thank you. It's so important. It is why we are where we are today with raising the presence and the awareness of this issue and driving co-sponsors. Wait, can we put that back up, please? But also, if you've already acted, you're not done. We need you to do it again. So if you get out your phones, if you're online, get out your phone. This is when I want you staring at that screen, unlike my teenager who I never want staring at the screen, but they seem to do it all the time. Text ACT, A-C-T, capital letters, to 96387. And that will click you right into our amazingly easy advocacy center that gives you pre-populated emails, letters to send. Send them now. Send them now. Flood their inbox. They haven't done it yet, so let's get it over the finish line. Ask them again. And the other thing I would really encourage you, because the clock is ticking. Congress has an alarmingly few days left this legislative session. We're way under, I think we're under 20 days left in session this calendar year. So we need to pressure them to do it now. So another great way when you get home, or even when you're on a break, although they're not there today, Saturday, on Monday, call your members of Congress. Those phone calls matter. For those of you who've ever been up on the Hill with us, you know those front offices are busy with the phones ringing, and when issues are hot, those phones ring off the hook. They pay attention to that. So we need to bug them, and we need to tell them this matters to us, and to get all your friends and family to do it too. We've got to create that sense of urgency. The docket is very long in Congress. We need them to do this now, and guess who's going to do it? The CF community. So that's what we're going to do. So text and call.
Thanks so much, Mary. I hope everyone is very energized to take action now. There's really easy ways to do that, and your story, your voice, it matters. So we're gonna be opening up to some audience Q&A, but very, very quickly, in our last minute or so, 30 seconds or less, last final question. What is one thing that you wish people understood about the threat of AMR and how we can carry this discussion forward? I'll answer very quickly. Personally, I wish people understood how resilient and adaptive bacteria are and how quickly they can mutate and fend off antibiotics. And carrying this discussion forward really requires education on the threat, understanding use and overuse, and really just spurring the conversation. So round robin, I'll go to Mary.
To me? Oh, sorry. I would say there's a solution at hand. There are multiple solutions at hand. I think, again, we're putting our money where our mouth is on the science, and we also have a really interesting, innovative solution on the other end of PASTEUR. So I think, to me, it's hope, but we got to get it done. We got to get it across the finish line.
Kevin?
All the work that the NIH has done for decades, there's amazing science out there. Carbex, we've seen everything that's going on in the world in terms of preclinical research in this area. The science is amazing. The economics is what's broken. And so, Ella, you said Callistin didn't work for you, that's kind of a last line antibiotic. I've talked to multiple CF patients who are on really the last antibiotic. If we want something new for you and people like you, we need to start now in order to have it ready for patients, honestly, in 5 to 10 years. So PASTEUR would do that. It'll take a little time, but every day that we wait is another day that folks are unprotected.
Tiffany?
Thank you. I will attack it from a scientific perspective here. I think what I would hope that people would see from AMR is how important detection is becoming. Kevin mentioned a bit about antimicrobial stewardship in the future, and I think we have to treat what we can detect. So I think as we move into these new antibiotics, thinking about the detection aspect is going to be really important. Also, I'm going to steal another important one, and that's data sharing in conferences like this, and just sitting at your dinner table talking about antimicrobial resistance and the pandemic and things like that, because this really is a global issue. And I think the more we have conversation about it, the more we normalize the conversation and what we need to do, the better we'll be able to fight this together.
Thank you. All right. To start us off in the last few minutes that we have, is the Cures 2.0 Act also included in our current advocacy efforts?
I can take that. So Cures 2.0 is, as its latter half of its name implies, a second iteration of a pretty large legislative package that was initially called 21st Century Cures Act. And as that name implies, it was an amalgamation of a lot of different ideas and pieces of legislation to try to advance therapeutic development faster. It passed several years ago now, and they're thinking about, well, what's next? What else do we do? There are definitely components of this very large piece of legislation that the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation likes and supports, and a few things we have questions on. One good thing is that PASTEUR Act is part of Cures 2.0. And I think really the top line here is, as I said, the clock is ticking in this year's legislative cycle. And as Kevin said, we need to do this now. So we at the CF Foundation are completely agnostic to how we get this bill done. We just want to get it done. So Cures is an option. I actually think it's unlikely to be the option in 2022, but it's certainly something out there that we're paying attention to.
And so once the PASTEUR Act becomes law, which we hope that it does, what is next for advocacy within the antibiotic resistant space?
What's next for advocacy beyond PASTEUR?
Yes.
Oh, come to our session in another hour. I think the cystic fibrosis community's needs are vast and broad, and therefore our advocacy agenda matches that. So we advocate for everything from research and development, including, really importantly, always funding for the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, the FDA, a critical partner in us getting drugs into the hands of patients. And also on the other end, to make sure that everybody has care that they can afford, that they can access, and it is this specialized quality care that we know everyone deserves. So our advocacy agenda is rich. I don't think in the few minutes we have left I can do it justice, but come to our session on advocacy or grab any one of us. We're always happy to talk about our agenda. But our advocacy agenda is whatever people with CF need.
To switch focus a little bit, obviously detection is very critical to getting appropriate treatment fast as possible. So what are some of the, what is involved with detection? What entities are focusing on detection of resistant bacteria?
Tiffany, you want to do that? Probably Kevin or Tiffany.
I can say something briefly. So diagnostics are part of the CARB-X mission. We look at therapeutics and prevention, but also diagnostics. And one of the companies we have supported is Proteus, which is a spin out from the University of Edinburgh. And they are developing a way to quickly diagnose lung infection without some of the difficulties, shall we say, of getting samples in order to then culture lung infection. And the purpose of this was that clinicians were saying that we need better, faster, quicker, more accurate ways to diagnose what's happening in a lung infection. Their work is broader than just CF, all sorts of lung infections, but exactly, applicable as well to cystic fibrosis. So people are working on this. The question then is getting it all the way across the line to, something that is in the hands of every doctor who needs it.
And Ella, as you know, detection and diagnosis is a focus area for our initiative. So there's a lot of new detection processes that we're looking at. And so just a shameless plug, if you want to learn more about detection, join us in our infection section tomorrow. But we are actually engaged with detection companies right now. So there's a lot of promise, at least coming from the foundation in that space too, that we'll be happy to share in the future.
Thank you. That is exciting. And let's see. So this is kind of a more broad question, but maybe just to give more of the background and understanding of the antibiotic resistance. How is it identified and how is it measured? Tiffany, maybe you want to answer that, or Kevin?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So just the evolution of a pathogen, right? Like as they interact with more antibiotics, they build this resistance. So that's, typically how we start to measure. Like the antibiotics that we have don't work against those drugs anymore. So, a lot of that work is done in the laboratory, and there's a lot of different methods that we use to determine that. But, from a clinical practice, you can start to see when those antibiotics are no longer working. And Kevin, I don't know if you want to add a little bit too about globally how we look at antimicrobial resistance.
I was going to say the core tool that a microbiologist uses probably hasn't changed in almost 100 years, unfortunately. And so there's a lot of new technologies trying to completely update that. I mean, can you imagine, our phones aren't the same as 100 years ago, nothing we do. But what they'll do is take a petri dish and put the bacteria in it and then different antibiotics in the dish, and they'll see how quickly it grows or doesn't grow and measure that. And, we need new technologies, completely new ways of doing it. And some of them are based in genetics and some of them are based on other exciting ideas. But getting those, into the hands of physicians, we did it very quickly for COVID, relatively quick. And we need to do the same for all bacteria, and not just in the US, but around the world, because we can't treat what we don't know. And if we treat it with the wrong drug, we're building resistance. So getting the diagnosis right is so important.
I'll switch back now to the PASTEUR Act and the conversation around that. Is there a broad consensus for it? And can you talk about what keeps it from getting a vote? And is there a way to? Well, we've already talked about this a little bit, but advocating for the urgency of it.
Yeah, I think there is broad understanding and of the risk of antibiotic resistance on the Hill. Yet I don't think there is as much sense of urgency as perhaps we all feel in this community. And somebody like Kevin feels, looking broadly across the antibiotic resistance. They understand it, but Congress isn't always so good at looking ahead. So what's standing in the way? I think there are two things. One, I spoke about already. The agenda is long and the time is short. So one of the things that's standing in the way is prioritizing this and saying this must pass. This has to happen this year. So again, that's our job, right? Raise the volume there. The other thing is cost. This bill costs about $11 billion. That is again designed to fund that subscription service that Kevin described. And anytime you tack any cost onto things, people on the Hill ask questions and take a pause. So that's another piece of our job too, is to say this is a value. This is money worth spending. And the story, the CDC data that just came out this week, one of the things that report talked about was just how much the US is already spending on antibiotic resistance. Medicare alone spending billions of dollars to take care of people who have infections that we cannot treat. So rest assured, we're already flooding the Hill with that data, that new data that just came out, to say, please people, 11 billion is a drop in the bucket. We've got to get this done now. So those are the two things I think are standing in the way from what we hear on the Hill: cost and prioritization.
And if I could add just something briefly, it's 11 billion over a decade. It's the equivalent of every American buying one latte at Starbucks a year. It's like 30% of what we pay for toilet paper every year. I mean, 11 billion on a decade in order so that people will actually have a drug that saves their life, that we don't fall into the pre-antibiotic era when people would die from a scratch in the garden, because they become infected, or people that have cancer treatment or any sort of routine surgery won't be dying from infection. So I agree that no one opposes PASTEUR that I've ever talked to in Washington, but the question is prioritization and cost, and I just can't imagine we can't find in this country just a little more than $1 billion per year to do this, to keep us in the antibiotic era.
And Kevin just gave you your talking points for your phone call you're going to make on Monday.
That really puts it into perspective. There needs to be focus that is reasonable to commit to that monetary value, and we should all be advocating. I'll be talking about this because it really is an important topic, a really important issue that's going to affect all of our lives in the future.
Ella, can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
On getting this done, is everyone listening right now, you are a key army. We have 60 members of the House of Representatives today who have signed onto the bill. You can look at who those are if you Google PASTEUR Act and the co-sponsors. You can find the list. And only 3 senators. So the 2 that sponsored it, Young from Indiana and Burnett from Colorado, and I think Collins, I'm looking at Scott, Collins, yes, I got a thumbs up. Good, I'm doing my job well. From Maine. I'm going to say most of your senators are not on that list, and probably a majority of your representatives. So that is the marching order. Make it matter to your members of Congress. Each of you have 2 senators and a member of the House. Call them, tell them to get it done, because odds are good that they're not a co-sponsor right now.
Thanks for that message. We have to do this. We have to do this all together. So we are out of time. We're actually a few minutes over. I know we can talk about this all day. I want to thank you, all 3 of you, for being part of such an important discussion, and really is vital for all of us, for all Americans. So thank you to everyone who joined us and really is committed here today, and urging your Congress members and to pass the PASTUER Act. So I now want to turn it over to Ray.